the process and the sort of original commitments of the society are always being restated in this often rather similar ways, but in which novelty and freshness, openness, good, bad, and indifferent take such a much higher place than in Europe, very much deliberately post-traditional bioethics. And I think, one can see, and some of us have written about this, in the coinage of the term bioethics, or it's in its adoption, its widespread adoption, generation and a half ago. And in a sense, the coining of a new term for a new kind of conversation. Bioethics is a convenience, of course, because it gets out of the medicine context, it broadens issue into bioscience, biomedicine, but also in that it seems to set a fresh starting point. One of the things I've always enjoyed doing when I get a new bioethics book, which are usually pretty unreadable, and I'm sure we all flick through these things, just occasionally actually read them. Most bioethicists write so badly, as we all know, of course, except those around this table. You look at the index and you look at the bibliography and you try to find anything before, 1970, 1980, depending when it is, and it's very rare. And of course, there's a huge Western tradition, which has had its literary accompaniments of discussions of these questions, whether they've been framed in medical terms or framed in moral philosophical terms. But the more American the book, the less likely you are to get a reference back before, whenever a line is being drawn. It seems to me one can indeed make this contrast, and I think there are certainly points to be learned on both sides. But I want to look ahead, and in a sense what I'm trying to do in my own thinking is to find a way to retool this exercise in which we have all been engaged in all sorts of ways over the last generation and a half, for the technology questions and to a degree for the societal questions of the 21st century, which of course began 10 years ago, but I think in many ways we haven't yet woken up to. I think many of the big debates of the last 10 years about issues in bioethics basically were an appendage to the 20th century in its technologies and its questions and its concerns, and these issues don't go away. But I think they've been quite surprisingly not focused on those questions which are being raised by emerging technologies. Now, there was some reference yesterday, of course, to the National Science Foundation's infamous NBIC document, the so-called report on converging technologies, which had a distinctly enhancement transhumanist flavor to it, and which was widely interpreted in Europe as a US government document, official document with policy implications, even though it was just a bunch of conference papers. Put forward by some energetic scientific civil servants who happen to have personal views, but it was perhaps the only major focus of conversation in the last 10 years at the interface of ethics and policy, which has in fact anticipated the questions being raised by emerging technologies. So I think it has had value in a whole series of debates that have been focused around it. Now, what we've seen, of course, is what I've called mission creep on the part of this sort of medical bioethics, biomedical ethics, whatever you want to call it, as it sought to encompass new technology questions. Of course, we had a case made yesterday for its encompassing environmental questions, which seems to be a terminological issue. I don't think it's you can play these things either way. But when you get into some of these new questions, of course, people have come up with new words, and you can stick on the prefix you choose for the technology of your choice. And so, of course, we have neuroethics, and we have nanoethics, and and cyborg ethics, and you can just go on coining these terms, and there are probably 8 or 10 of them which are being used now. And of course, you can claim to be a founder of a discipline, and you could edit the key book on the subject, and you can set up a society, and so on and so forth. And these things have value. But I think one of my problems with what has been going on is that it seems to be premised on the notion that bioethics was a success, it showed us the way, it's given us a tool, we can just take all this bioethics stuff and apply it to the questions raised by some new technology issue, which is a non-bio issue, or primarily a non-bio issue, and Bob's your uncle, we can do the same thing and it'll work again. Now, I'm by no means convinced it worked the first time. I think there has been very significant value in the efforts of people in bioethics over the last generation and a half, including of one or two of those who have been around this table in the last day. I mean, I think very significant contributions have been made to seeking to create some sort of framework of societal evaluation of these technologies and the way in which they apply to human health and well-being. But that is not at all to say that I think bioethics has been a success. We have difficult enough defining bioethics if you were to try to define what would be seen as success in bioethics. I think that would be another interesting exercise and a difficult exercise. I think there are many illusions in the way in which contemporary bioethics has operated. One of them is as to its influence in the policy arena, which I think has been very limited. This is partly a problem with the academy. Plainly, academics tend to believe in ideas, do we not? And therefore we tend to believe that the exposition of ideas is going to have an influence, do we not? And therefore we tend to believe that a well-crafted report or a book which makes a fine case and we see these as the outputs of our efforts, and of course these are often counted as the outputs of our efforts by funders. The actual effect they have as, if you like, inputs into the social order and the development of policy or the broader development of culture, which ultimately leads to policy as one of its subsets, I think is very unclear. And I think we're probably moving into a generation where academic type inputs have less and less impact on cultural development of cultural assumptions and on particular policy decisions. And I think bioethicists need to be much more looking in a mirror and reflecting on the significance or otherwise of what it is they've been seeking to accomplish. I think also and I think this is the transatlantic question. In some ways, Europe has been more open to incorporating these questions into its policy thinking. This is partly evident, of course, from the structure of European Group on Ethics and its role in the office of the President of the Commission and so on. I think it's true in all sorts of other ways. There's a lot more funding for these things in Europe than tends to be in the States. But I'm not convinced this means that policy is really going to be shaped by these conversations in the way in which one might wish it to be, and in a way which I think some people naively assume it will be. I think in the States it's been, if you like, more obvious, and I think this has been true on both ends. I mean, the old National Bioethics Advisory Commission, Clinton body, and then George Bush's Presidential Commission, President's Council on Bioethics, they had remarkably little impact on policy. I mean, they caused controversies and public debates, which are very useful things, but in terms of actual policy impact, their efforts were very limited. And one of the ways in which I see bioethics in the policy arena is, if you like, something that's been played. I mean, bioethicists have been played by governments. They've been put on commissions. They've been told to write reports. And it's made them think they're influencing things, and it's quieted, of course, public discussion. And one doesn't have to take the view that bioethics has, in and of itself, tended to speed the progress of the technologies it's meant to be critiquing, which of course is a view that has been argued, and I think which has some traction, to take the view that for bioethicists to be funded and set up in institutions and given reports to write and put on public advisory bodies and sometimes on regulatory bodies has been a way to remove them from the arena of policy making, certainly as much as it's been a way to bring them into it. And of course this is partly what in Washington we call Potomac fever, which is the idea that when you have some little tiny role in the government process, you immediately think you're terribly important, and it goes to your head and you lose any sense of perspective. And I think there's an element of that in the way that when bioethics has touched the policy arena, bioethicists have tended to think of themselves in ways that history will judge to have been disproportionately significant. So I have a general anxiety about the way confidence we have in bioethics as an enterprise, however you narrowly define it, as a model for how to handle questions raised by neuroscience, neurotechnology, AI, virtual reality, and so on and so forth. These things are going to happen. That seem to me, if you take a kind of you know, middle view of the timescales and the impact and so on, as you look at